Okay, so as I want to be a future teacher, you know how in your kindergarten all the way through high school, if kid A punches kid B, so kid B in defense hits kid A back, who gets in trouble? Both children. Why? You shouldn't hit. You just, two wrongs don't make a right. That's what we've learned all as we're growing up. So why is it when it's something as extreme as murder, the government is allowed to kill us in return? Again, as to repeat what Rob had said, the Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment. Death is one of the worst things you could probably ever do to someone. Murder, everyone knows that murder is not right. So why is it that in return we can murder? There's no real reason why that should be justice. In an extreme case, Saddam Hussein, he had killed his citizens all the time. So why is it that the United States, a civilized nation, is allowed to kill our own citizens? Some of the people who have been sentenced to death are actually mentally ill, as in they have no idea what they're doing. It may seem like, if someone has stabbed, for example, CNN article had mentioned Charles Singleton. He was actually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He had stabbed a woman while he was robbing a grocery store. Before the stab wounds had actually killed her, she was hospitalized, and she actually was able to identify him before she had died. But the problem is he was schizophrenic. It's an extreme case of schizophrenia at that. There's no proof that he actually knew what he was doing was wrong, or even if he realized that he was stabbing the woman. I mean, he probably did it in what he believed was self-defense. There was a book on a study called Double Tragedy, and it mentioned that 100 people of the people who have been put to death were actually mentally ill. Now, 1,246 people have been put to death. So that's roughly 10% of everybody who has been put to death because of death row was mentally ill. Another main problem is the jurors. In the death, you need, there are 12 jurors to prove if you deserve the death penalty. So the requirement for these jurors is you have to be impartial to both death penalty and life in prison. But for most people who approve of the death penalty, it's hard to know if they are actually willing to give someone life in prison before death, actually the death penalty. So if they give, let's say the person deserves it, it's in the court, they'd agree, yes, this person needs to die. That's how it is. If the person is later proved innocent after they're put to death, there's no way to take that back. That's your mistake, and all 12 of those jurors, the judge has to live with that mistake. Luckily, so far, there's only been one person who was proved innocent after being put to death. However, that's still one too many. DeathPenaltyInfo.org actually has a list of 138 people who were sentenced to death and then found innocent. The average number of years on death row before being proved innocent is 10 years. Now in death row, in most prisons, it's a separate spot, and you're put with other murderers. So you're seen, even if you're innocent, you are seen as a murderer. Now imagine if you were accused of murder, even though you know you're innocent, and you had to spend 10 years with these people, that are actually murderers. Imagine the mental abuse, the physical abuse, and even the verbal abuse. Every day of those 10 years, you fear for your life. Now, 17 out of these 138 were proved innocent through DNA. That means that DNA was not used in the court to prove if they were guilty. Now, how can you prove that someone deserves to die without even using DNA? That means the physical evidence is just not there. 76% of the 138 cases were actually proved innocent, were actually the wrong verdict because of incompetent defense lawyers, misconduct between police and prosecutors, and or misinformed and biased judges and juries. There was an article in The Atlantic about a man named Rolando Cruz. According to the jury, he had murdered, raped, and sexually assaulted a 10-year-old girl. There was no physical evidence that had actually linked him to the victim. 12 years after he was put in prison, 12 years he was on death row, they had another case, and the DNA proved that Cruz was innocent. It actually proved that a man named Brian Dugan was guilty. Now, 10 years before this, which would be 2 years after the incident, Brian Dugan had confessed to this crime. He also confessed to 5 other vicious crimes. Now, Dugan, however, was not sentenced to death. Even after these, the confessions, and even though Cruz was still in prison for this, Dugan was instead given life in prison. So in conclusion, too much can go wrong to approve of the death penalty. It's not fair to the people who are innocent. Although it is a small number, it's still 10%. And that's just, I'm sorry, it's not 10%, it's about 1%. And 1% is still, it's just too much to do to the poor innocent people.